Heard somebody say, I'm a visual learner or I'm an auditory learner. Well, research spanning nearly 2 decades is concluding that learning styles theory is actually closer to a myth than research proven fact. In this talk, I'm going to present an overview of the history and controversy of learning styles theory, and I'll explain why the School of Education Professions here at CCU has chosen to remove this unproven theory from our ed prep programs. So I'm Jeff Renfrow. I'm the Director of Undergraduate Teacher Prep Programs here at CCU and our School of Education Professions. During our time together, I'm going to be discussing with you what learning styles theory really is, make sure we're on the same page about the terminology. I'm going to talk a little bit about why it's believed. Then I'm going to go into the research that shows why it can't be believed. And then I'm going to then transition into why we shouldn't believe it. And that's a little bit of a different topic. It's more about why we shouldn't be practicing learning styles. And then at the end, I'm going to offer up a few suggestions of, where do we go now that we, assuming that you agree that learning styles theory is essentially pseudoscience, what do we do with that information? Let's go ahead and get started. So learning styles theory puts forward the notion that different people prefer to take in information in different ways, and therefore learn more effectively when they receive instruction in a way that conforms to this self-identified learning preference. In other words, according to learning styles theory, people who are identified or self-identify as visual learners will learn better if they receive instruction presented visually. Auditory learners would learn best by listening, and kinesthetic learners would learn best by engaging in the learning physically or tactily. Now, at some point, you may have, let me back that up. At some point, you may have pigeonholed yourself as a learner by taking one of the many learning styles inventories out there, or maybe you've just self-diagnosed your personal learning style. Well, by the end of our time together, I'm hoping that you will forever ditch the idea that you or anyone else can be pigeonholed as a learner in this way. So it's important that we make sure that we're clearly defining what we mean when we say learning style. Too often this concept gets confused with other things like personality traits, like introversion or agreeableness, or even sometimes it gets confused with things like a Myers-Briggs profile. Learning styles is very commonly confused with cognitive processing science. And the most common example of this is when people use learning style interchangeably with Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences, or MI. You may recall that MI theory explains that people have relative cognitive strengths, or intelligences, in domains like interpersonal, visual, musical, mathematical, and so on. These relative intelligence strengths predispose individuals for aptitudes as athletes or musicians or dancers, mathematicians, etc. Well, in 2013, Dr. Gardner himself wrote an article for the Washington Post where he attempted to separate his theory of multiple intelligences from learning styles. And he contends that learning styles are, in fact, a myth, and he shares the same reasons that I'm going to be sharing with you in just a few moments. The essential difference between MI and learning styles, according to Gardner himself, is that learning styles theory attempts to explain that an individual has preferences for how information enters the brain. Multiple intelligences theory explains how a person actually processes information and demonstrates the knowledge after it enters the brain, and regardless of how it enters the brain. In other words, learning styles theory asserts that the best way for a person to learn is to take in the information either visually, auditorily, or kinesthetically, based on their so-called preferred learning style. It's an input model of learning, whereas multiple intelligences asserts that people have different cognitive strengths in regards to how they process and demonstrate what they learn. It's an output model, and that's the most significant difference between learning styles theory and multiple intelligences theory. So if you hear someone say, for example, my son is an auditory learner, they're speaking to the idea of learning styles. If you hear someone say, my daughter is musically gifted or has people smarts, they're speaking to multiple intelligences. So I just wanted to be clear that MI and learning styles are fundamentally two different concepts with very different implications for teaching and learning. And to be clear, multiple intelligences theory does have its fair share of doubters, but the body of evidence to refute it is far smaller than the body of evidence refuting learning styles. So I spent so much time on distinguishing learning styles from multiple intelligences because this really seems to be the biggest sticking point for people when they're asked to consider that learning styles is bad science. It would be a sticking point for me as well if I thought they were somehow the same thing, and honestly, for a long time I did. But now that we know that they are not the same thing, and we know this straight from the mouth of Howard Gardner himself, but we can still believe, however, that people probably do have relative strengths and weaknesses in how we process and make sense of the world after the information enters our brain. Let's move on to a brief discussion now of just how pervasive this belief in learning styles theory really is. So in 2017, there was a study of various neuromyths, and one of those was, what percentage of people believe still in the myth of learning styles. So when we look at this, I'd like you to kind of guess for yourself, what percentage of the general public do you think still believes that learning styles or teaching to learning styles is good practice? And the answer is 93%. The vast majority believe that learning styles or teaching to learning styles is a valid practice. And what percentage of trained professional practicing teachers do you think still believes in learning styles, at least back in 2017? A full 3/4 of teachers do. The fact that 93% of the general public still believes in learning styles theory can be excused, but the fact that 3 out of every 4 teachers still believe this is, quite frankly, disturbing. And I'm not saying that they should know better because they should have done the research. Teachers don't have time to do this kind of research, but their teaching colleges and their curriculum experts in their schools and districts should have done this research and shared the truth with them. This research started almost 20 years ago, the research that is essentially debunking learning styles theories. Now, clearly, this isn't happening in schools and in teacher prep programs like it should. So we know most people still believe that teaching to a person's perceived learning style is a best practice. This leads us to the next topic, which is an exploration of why it's believed, despite the absence of empirical evidence to support the practice, and in spite of the fact that there is evidence that teaching to learning styles is actually counterproductive. So similar to the previous slide, and as is so often the case, one of the reasons it's still believed is that people simply aren't aware of the absence of research to support it, and the growing body of research that actually refutes it. They, like I, heard about it somewhere from someone they trusted. It seemed to make good sense at the time, and so why would they doubt its truthfulness? I get it. When something doesn't fit into our existing schemas or our firmly held understandings, it creates what's called cognitive dissonance. It's probably something you've heard of and experienced many times by now. We'll generally tend to avoid cognitive dissonance rather than spend the time and energy necessary to consider that our beliefs might be unfounded. And that's partly what contributes to the very well-known phenomenon of confirmation bias. People's belief that learning styles makes good intuitive sense and just sounds like it should work is believed to be a big reason why it's been hanging on for so long. We just tend to want to value our own beliefs if those beliefs seem to be based in common sense or were informed by people we trust. Or if we do choose to dig into the facts, we often look for those data points that support our current convictions. Again, confirmation bias creeping in. By the way, confirmation bias will be coming up again a little later. It seems to be essentially an underlying theme that contributes to the perpetuation of the learning styles myth. Another reason it's still believed is the influence of the K-12 professional development marketplace. The learning styles PD market is massive. It's a multi-million-dollar industry. When learning styles theory came onto the scene in the 90s, it was an idea that was easy to explain, easy to understand, easy to package, easy to market, easy to sell, and most importantly, it was easy to believe. I mean, if all the publishers, professional developers, and even my school district's instructional leaders believed it to be true, then why shouldn't I as a classroom teacher? And I say I because I need to be the first to admit that I also drank the learning styles Kool-Aid back in the 90s when I first started teaching. I didn't learn it was a pseudoscience until just a few years ago. As a K-12 educator, I simply didn't have the time to do my own research into the truthfulness of the claims of any number of instructional programs and methods being adopted. I especially didn't feel compelled to research the truthfulness of learning styles theory because, honestly, the ideas presented seemed plausible. Again, an underlying form of confirmation bias at work when I took the hook, line, and sinker of learning styles theory. The final reason people still believe that I'll share with you is that parents started hearing about learning styles not long after the self-esteem parenting movement began. It wasn't long before parents were demanding that their child be taught in a way that best suited their self-identified learning style. And for the reasons mentioned earlier, parents are still holding on to the myth that their child was unique in this particular way and should be taught based upon his or her perceived learning style preference, which in itself is a bit ironic because pigeonholing your child into one of 4 or 5 categories of learner actually puts limits on what the child may be able to accomplish. And it does nothing to value their true uniqueness and the complexity of their God-given intelligence. Nevertheless, if you've ever worked in K-12, you'll know that parent expectations, misguided or otherwise, can have a very strong influence in some schools' instructional programming decisions. So enough about why people still tend to believe in learning styles theory. Clearly they do. It is clear that the myth is still alive and well. Let's get into the real meat of this presentation. Let's talk about the evidence that should compel us to stop believing in it. We're going to start with how our well-known human frailties speak into the challenges of creating valid and reliable self-reporting tools like the Myers-Briggs and the many learning styles inventories out there. You're probably well aware that as humans, we are notorious for inaccurately perceiving our true nature. As an example, a study showed that on average, people will rate their driving skills at 7 out of 10. In other words, most people think they drive better than most people. Now, that statement is obviously statistically impossible, and it's an example of what psychologists call illusory superiority. When we combine this effect with the effect of confirmation bias discussed earlier, it's really no surprise that we just aren't very good at self-reporting when it comes to things like our psychology and our personality. This internal bias that we all carry with us is revealed in a 2010 study that tested the reliability and validity of several of the most commonly used learning styles inventories. The results showed that none of the inventories were statistically valid or reliable. None of them. In other words, they did not actually measure the constructs they purported to measure, and they were even unreliable in doing that consistently. Now, this is a huge problem for learning styles theory. I mean, how can we teach to a person's learning style preference when we can't be sure we've accurately identified what that preference actually is? Now, for the sake of argument, let's just pretend for a moment that we could accurately identify a person's learning style preference, even though we know we can't, at least not currently. Even if this were the case, the current body of research on learning and on this topic does not support teaching to individual learning styles as an effective practice. To be fair, there is a small body of research that shows support for teaching to learning styles. However, much of it is published in predatory journals, and none of these studies have been able to be replicated. There is one exception that I need to mention. In 2017, a study out of Australia showed that teaching to learning styles had an effect size of 0.13. To my knowledge, this particular study has not been replicated, but even if it has, an effect size of 0.13, while positive, would make this practice so insignificant in its impact that it, quite frankly, doesn't rise to any level of recommendation for practice. The fact is, there is exponentially more research that refutes the positive effect of teaching to learning styles. Let's take a quick dive into some of this research. In 2008, a team of researchers led by Harold Pashler conducted a fairly robust analysis of learning styles literature. After an in-depth analysis of many learning styles research studies, Pashler and his team found that none of them met the basic standards of quality research design, and none of them were able to demonstrate that teaching to a person's perceived learning style produced a result that is different than not teaching to their perceived learning style. In the interest of time, rather than going into the details of Pashler's team's analysis, I thought it would be illuminating to simply share a statement from their conclusion. Paschler and his team conclude that the contrast between the enormous popularity of the learning styles approach within education and the lack of credible evidence for its utility is, in our opinion, striking and disturbing. If classification of students' learning styles has practical utility, it remains to be demonstrated. The following year, in 2009, Josh Cuevas conducted a meta-analysis of nearly all of the prior research on learning styles. Again, instead of doing a deep dive into the many pieces of research examined in his study, I want to share this passage from Dr. Cuevas's conclusion. Dr. Cuevas concludes by saying that the learning styles hypothesis has been refuted by empirical research to the extent that it may be considered irresponsible for teacher education programs and public educators to apply the method in practice. We're going to talk a little bit more when we get to why we shouldn't be believing in learning styles about that statement there. But I will say that the biggest influence of Dr. Cuevas's conclusion seems to be based on the fact that, at best, many of the studies in his research did not return a positive result. And at worst, some of the studies returned a negative result, showing that people actually learned less when presented with instruction that only aligned to their self-reported learning style. In 2018, a research paper titled "Another Nail in the Coffin for Learning Styles" was published. Now, nearly all prior learning styles research was centered around formal learning situations, like school-based learning. This particular study sought to see if perhaps learning styles might work in learning occurring outside of school, commonly called informal learning. This study demonstrated no correlation between approaching informal learning through the lens of a person's perceived learning style and the learning outcome, essentially demonstrating that learning styles theory does not work in either formal or informal learning contexts. The author of this study concluded that strong evidence that instructors and students should not be promoting the concept of learning styles for studying and or for teaching interventions. Thus, the adage of, "I can't learn subject X because I'm a visual learner," should be put to rest once and for all. The story doesn't end here. Not only does the research demonstrate that teaching to learning styles is ineffective, the more this topic gets studied and the more we learn about fixed mindset, the more the evidence seems to show that teaching to learning styles, even if they did exist, can actually result in less learning. And I know that I sound like I'm beating a dead horse here, but this is actually very important for us to understand. And this is the topic of our focus question number 4. One reason why learning styles theory shouldn't be believed, or more importantly, shouldn't even be practiced, is that by having students label themselves as a certain type of learner, we could be encouraging them to develop what researcher Carol Dweck has called a fixed mindset. A fixed mindset is one in which a person's belief of what they can achieve is somehow limited by their inherited characteristics. An example of this is when a person is convinced they are an auditory learner. They may believe that information presented to them visually or kinesthetically will be harder to learn, developing a sense of learned helplessness in non-auditory learning contexts. Also, when a teacher does not take the time to differentiate the learning experience to match the student's perceived learning style, the student and his or her parents may incorrectly believe that the teacher does not care about the student as a learner with unique learning style needs. The opposite of a fixed mindset is known as a growth mindset, which is when a person believes that effort can and does make a difference, regardless of one's inherited characteristics, and that the brain is complex and adaptable enough to allow for learning in many modalities and contexts. In fact, that's exactly what neuroscience is revealing every day that research is conducted on how we learn. Neuroscience is showing that our brain utilizes all of the aspects of its powers in order to make sense of the world and all of the modalities within the brain. We are all essentially, if we are a typically developing person, we are able to very adeptly switch between the different modalities within our brain as our brain needs to conduct the learning. And so the basic assumption of learning styles theory is that good instruction makes learning less painful or easier. Another reason we shouldn't believe or practice teaching to learning styles is that recent studies coming out of cognitive sciences are indicating that easy learning will not be lasting learning. Many studies have shown that when learners are easily able to access and demonstrate a task, they are more likely to forget the learning than those who had to experience what Bjork calls desirable difficulties. And I've always called it earning your learning. But I think cognitive science Daniel Willingham said it best when his research concluded that learning is the residue of thought. So as it turns out, teaching to learning styles, again, even if they did exist, would result in less learning, despite the incredible amount of effort it takes to implement the idea with fidelity. Which brings me to my final reason why it shouldn't be believed. The final reason we shouldn't be practicing learning styles is that in education, we're constantly working to optimize our students' learning while working within the constraints of very limited resources like time, personal energy, and funding. For decades, schools and teachers have invested enormous amounts of all three of these resources to try to live up to the hype of learning styles. And to what end? At best, learning was not optimized, and at worst, we were actually doing harm. If we truly aspire to optimize the potential of our students, we need to stop trafficking in instructional pseudoscience and invest our limited resources in those instructional ideas that are actually proven to make a difference. It's my opinion, which is informed by what I shared with you today and quite a bit of other research that I haven't shared with you, that learning styles theory is, in fact, pseudoscience, which is why we no longer teach it as a viable strategy in our programs here in the School of Education Professions. So where do we go from here? If we shouldn't be designing instruction to match the perceived learning styles of our students, how should we be designing our instruction? And that's the topic of our final discussion. Hopefully you'll find some instructional usefulness and some hope in these ideas. The good news about all of this is that we now have empirical evidence that supports a decision to keep doing something that good teachers have always done, long before learning styles theory came onto the scene 30 years ago. And that is to consider your learning goal, which defines the context and the intended outcome of the learning, and make an informed decision about which instructional modalities make the most sense to be used to facilitate that learning. In other words, the context of the learning goal determines how it should be taught, or what we call the instructional modality. Although this still looks similar to learning styles, the application is flipped, in that the instructional modalities chosen for a given lesson are based on the context of the learning goal, not individual students' perceived learning styles, which we now know don't truly exist. And I will clarify, people do have perceptions about what their learning style preference is. The research is showing that it is not valid. It's not reliable, and teaching to a perceived learning style is actually not effective, if not counterproductive. So I just want to be clear. So here's a specific example of using planning, of planning around using instructional modalities as opposed to learning styles. In the context of teaching a beginner to play piano, you would want to make sure the student has an opportunity to experience the learning through seeing, listening, speaking, and touching, because that's how all typically developing people best learn to play the piano. Tasting, smelling, and reading would be less critical modalities in this particular context. The key point here is that context determines the instructional modality choices, not the student's perceived learning style. If we allow the perceived learning style to drive the instructional modality, we'd find ourselves only allowing our auditory learners to hear the piano being played, instead of allowing them to engage in all of the relevant modalities necessary to learn to actually play the piano. Here's another example. When teaching someone to cook, you would probably want to use all modalities at one point or another, because that's the way most typically developing people learn how to cook. If learning styles theory was being applied to a cooking lesson, those students whose identified learning preference was, say, visual, wouldn't have an opportunity to actually knead the dough or smell the oregano. Now, I know this sounds absurd, but this is exactly how teachers have been expected to apply learning styles theory in their core subjects like math, science, social studies, and English. So this is what we teach our teacher candidates in the School of Ed Professions, and quite frankly, this information should be liberating for our teacher candidates. The task of identifying our students' so-called learning styles and then designing lessons that differentiated how they received their instruction based on those learning styles is honestly very time-consuming, and we often fell far short of implementing the theory with fidelity. But we strived for this unreachable ideal because we believed it was effective. Now that we know it can actually harm students, all of that effort and the resources to support that effort can be redirected towards other evidence-based practices like contextualizing our lessons based on appropriate instructional modalities that make sense for all typically developing people. Now, I do want to point out that this is not saying that differentiation is not valid. We can eliminate learning styles without having to eliminate the concept of differentiating for content, product, and process based on each student's individual interests and needs, but just not based on a perceived learning style. So we're about to wrap this up here. Just want to review real quickly what we've talked about. We went over what learning styles theory is, at least according to the version that I'm talking about in this presentation. And more importantly, what it's not. We don't want to confuse it with multiple intelligences. We don't want to confuse it with other forms of differentiation. We talked about how confirmation bias and other psychological phenomenon are contributing to the ongoing belief of the learning styles myth. We talked about how the overwhelming majority of credible research on learning styles actually disproves it. And we talked about how even if learning styles could be identified, teaching to them would be destructive. And we briefly touched on the instructional planning implications and recommendations for those who believe that teaching to learning styles is not supported by research. In closing, I'm going to go back to a graphic we saw at the beginning of the presentation. Now, as misguided as this graphic is, when it comes to today's research-based evidence about learning, it also shows us that the answer to how we really do learn has been hiding in plain sight the whole time. The human mind is far too complex to attempt to pigeonhole how we can and should learn. But one thing that cognitive science seems to be saying loud and clear is that all typically developing humans are quite capable of accessing their visual, auditory, and kinesthetic aptitudes to make sense of the world around them. In other words, we are all visual learners, we are all auditory learners, and we are all kinesthetic learners. And this truth, although surrounded by the pseudoscience of learning styles for the last 30 years, has been in front of us the whole time. Thank you.